Manyalak, I'm sorry in saying this, but if you knew the law at the time and you had, if I'm not mistaken, due diligence studied by Ernst and Young, and I'm sure that you have your own legal, and you allowed such knowing that it is not compliant with the law at wala pong ibinigay ang Bangko Sentral ng Pilipinas na eligibility, pag ni-reverse po natin to, in a way, there could be a conspiracy with the private sector and the DPP. Because from my point of view, yung pong Bangko Sentral ng Pilipinas did their job in working on it, because there were many studies conducted by Ernst and Young during that time and other groups making those studies, and they very well know that there are legal parameters in the selling of accounts to the private sector.
Sir, obtaining the COE was basically a burden of the seller working with the BSP. So again, the contract actually contemplated the possibility that if you were to apply with the BSP and eventually you did not get a certificate, that was a possibility. Again, from our perspective, we wanted a certificate. We paid the price as if we were going to get a certificate. But in at least one instance in this, in the Lopez Group loans, we thought that we were going to get a certificate. We did not, for reasons that I do not know at this point. We can research further as to why we did not get the COE. But in at least one instance, there was an expectation that we would get a COE, but we did not.
So, Mr. Manyalak, you were made to believe by DBP that those accounts, those loans, can be transferred to your SPV, Lehman, Philippine Investment One, without need of eligibility. Yung pong eligibility, for your own consumption and for your interest, but DBP, in their presentation, qualified that there may be accounts that are not eligible and can be transferred to the special purpose vehicle.
Yes, sir. As far as I understand, there are means outside of the SPV Act to transfer such credits, assignment of credits under the Civil Code. And our understanding was that if in fact an asset was not transferred with COE certification under the SPV Act, then there would be other legal measures by which we could make that transfer.
Mr. Manyalak, not to, this was a long time ago, but would you know what process they mentioned aside from the SPV Act?
We do know, and even almost on a daily basis, there are purchases of credits and loans in the banking sector, in the finance sector, assignment of credit act, etc., etc. So this is fairly commonplace. The only difference, Honorable Defensor, is that under the SPV Act, you would be eligible for many benefits if you in fact did your transfer under the SPV Act, and especially with COE certification. So if transfers were made that did not have COE certification, then you would need to go to the Civil Code, and the benefits under the SPV Act would not apply to your transfer.
Thank you for that, Mr. Manyalak. Yung pong pag-transfer ng rights and assignments of rights, yes, it could be done easily within the private sector. But in government financial institutions, meron po kasing parameters on the book value. And I recall during this time, in fact, even earlier, Ernst & Young made a study of the National Home Mortgage and Finance Corporation. And in fact, they knew that we were constrained by certain parameters. But I'm not pointing at your company. You just made a bid, and it was the responsibility of the BP to make sure that it was eligible. But I just want to know, for the record, did they made you think, or they clarified that there are other parameters which you mentioned under the Civil Code which can be utilized? Was that the information given by DBP?
That was the information given by DBP. Also, I'm certain, I don't know the details, I'm certain by our counsel. For all of these contracts that we sign, Honorable Defensor, of course, we're very careful that we abide by the law. And I'm certain, I don't know the provision right now, I'm certain that under these contracts, there's a due authority clause where the seller assures us that they have the proper authority to transfer the assets to us.
Yes, that's correct, Mr. Manyalak. In fact, yun nga po yung minimension ko kanina, dahil dito po sa inyong contract mismo, you made sure and that there was a certification of eligibility, and of course, may warranties po. Kasi alam ko naman, and I understand, that being in the private sector and you do a bid, of course, kailangan po malinaw that all legal parameters, all compliances are done. So that's correct, Mr. Manyalak, and I thank you for that. Ang pangalawa ko pong tanong, Mr. Manyalak, if you don't mind, yung pagkakabili po, first on the 9 billion, on the total amount of 9 billion, how much were you able to, the 9 billion was sold to you at 3 billion?
That's what the record shows, sir.
Okay, so that's about 30 cents to a dollar, more or less, 35.
Yes po.
At ito pong pagkakabili sa inyo, would you have in mind, in total na lang po, how much were you able to sell it back to the creditors? I mean to the owners of the accounts or the borrowers?
Honorable Defensor, if we're talking about the entire portfolio, I don't have that number with me. Particularly because there are many of these accounts that are still outstanding. There are actually many accounts where we haven't paid, we haven't gotten a single centavo. So we continue to work on these accounts. If you are interested, I do have roughly the numbers for the Lopez Group loans, if you want total collections on those numbers. But on the 9 billion, I don't have that with me. I do know that a considerable number of those loans are still in the process of attempted collection, and there are quite a few where we haven't gotten any kind of payment at all since the purchase of these loans.
Yes, thank you for that, Mr. Manyalak. And most of these loans, I mean, yung po na naiwan po sa inyo are mostly ROPOAs na po. May mga real estate pa kayo na nandyan and you're trying to sell, more or less, Mr. Manyalak.
That is correct, Honorable Defensor.
Dito po sa Lopez loan na Mr. Manyalak of the 1.6 billion, magkano po nyo, okay, you maintained no, the borrower, of course the respective Lopez group of company, and then eventually there was a exit for them. Magkano po yung pagkakabili ninyo na 1.6 billion pala on the when you purchased it from DBP?
The total consideration, I'm looking at some of the numbers now, sir. The total consideration was 1.069 billion for the 1.66 billion face value loans. So it's about, as DBP had spoken earlier, I think it's about 64% of face.
Sir, question lang ho. Bakit po parang ang taas dito sa Lopez loan? On average, you have a 30%. Bakit po sa kanila nasa 64%?
I think that when we walk through some of the collections, iba-iba po yan. Ano? When we look at these types of loans, there are loans that are completely unsecured with companies that have absolutely no ability to repay, and those would be even single digits sometimes. So when we look at these portfolios, especially for exposures this large, we would look to the ability, the inherent ability of the borrower to repay. So you will find that, or if you will remember, these loans from the Lopez Group were actually sold in auction. There were maybe 4 or 5 participants for these auctions, and the prices seemed fairly close. So I think we had arrived at a market clearing price for each of these Lopez Group loans.
So, if it's sold at 64%, ito na po, personal na po to,
Yes,
from your investment banking point of view, At 64%, kung kayo po may hawak ng loans na to, hindi nyo ibibenta. Ibig sabihin, these are still very, very potential collectible loans.
Yes, sir. If I may put myself in the BP shoes, because they were the seller and we simply bid in their portfolio.
Yes, sir.
Ang nangyayari po niyan, because they, under the SPB Act, most of the banks, if not all of the banks, were capital constrained at that point in time. So na-realize po nila, kung ibibenta nila isa-isa yan, ang mabibili lang talaga yung may ability to repay, yung may collateral, yung may guarantee, yung may payment ability. And that was why I think also based on the Ernst & Young and ACRA advice to DPP, and this is what happens globally, sir, they would package these loans in portfolios na merong magaganda, makabayad, at merong alanganin. Because if they don't package that way, ang mabibili lang po sa kanila, yung magaganda, ang maiwan sa kanila, the worst credits, which will make banking life even tougher. So I think, if I understand correctly, the way DPP did this, they took in advisors and said, this is the best way to package this. Ihalo-halo nyo, merong maganda, may pangit, para yung bibili. They have no choice. Now, among the portfolio that we had bought with the Lopez Group loans, meron po talaga, as I mentioned, meron kaming 9-figure loans ngayon na hindi pa nababayaran. But these were some of the better credits within the portfolios that were sold by DPP.
Yes, I agree, Mr. Manyalak. So in the cherry picking of accounts, nasa high side yung Lopez accounts, sold at 64%, which basically, and you're correct, I agree with you, kung ako po ang DBP, hindi ko binenta. Ngayon, my next question would be, Mr. Manyalak, kasi po dapat mafo-foreclose na sila ng DBP. Pero hindi ko sila foreclose. When it was transferred to you, what was the term or how long were they able to fix the issue?
My understanding, just looking at the cash flows that came in, Honorable Defensor, was that we basically, or these loans were basically held almost as passive investments. And the reason for that is that 2 of the loans were already in rehab. And I think a third one, Central CATV, was either in restructuring or in rehab. So in that situation po, the creditor becomes very passive, ano? Yung rehabilitation receiver says, oh, ito, pwede ka na magbayad or hindi ka pwede magbayad. So we, as the owner of that credit at this point in time, will be simply receiving any cash flows approved by the court. And then in certain instances, such as may milad, or in this case, buy and tell, eventually, I think must have been in the 2008 through 2010 period, merong buyer of the debt or merong buyer of the company and says, look, bibiling ko na lang exposure mo. But if I'm looking at these loans, and given the experience we had with some of the other loans we have, based on the records, it looked like these loans were managed very passively. Meron nga pong rehab, so naghihintay na lang kami. And then may dumating na buyer, sabi ko, sige, ibenta nyo na. There are some loans, not including these, in the business that are very intensively managed po, ano, na tinatawagan nyo yung account holder, anong masisettle, anong collateral nyo, pwede nating, do you need more liquidity? Based on the records, just looking at some of these cash flows, and the fact that these companies were mostly in rehab or under restructuring, these were passively managed because of the nature of the credit, sir.
So, Mr. Manyalak, more or less, from the transfer to the SPV, nabigyan pa sila ng about 3 to 4 years to fix or to recover the loans.
Yes, sir. It looks that way. It looks like the collections were basically around the 2007 to 2010 period.
Yes. So, Mr. Manyalak, from you bought it for 1,069,000,000, magkano nyo po na ibenta?
Yung total collections po, no, yung total collections, I just want to speak globally because hindi pa po pino yung information namin, ano. But
Yes.
we are trying to find.
Yes.
Yung based on the records that we have, the total collections on the Lopez group of loans from DBP was about 1.25 billion. There was, if you look at the Annex A of our position paper, ang total na nakuha po ng Lehman from the Lopez Group loans is 1.45 billion. But apparently, and we just traced this late last night, if you look at our annex, there is a column at the very bottom, Central CATB. It looks like there was a purchase of Central CATB from a third party, sir. Aside from DBP, where there were additional collections. So the collections from the DBP Lopez Group loans was about 1.25 billion. If you want, I can go quickly to how much was collected for the Maynilad in Central CATB, sir. These were mostly, by the time the whole process was finished, these were paid at around par, so around 100%, maybe slightly less or slightly more. Yung Maynilad po at yung Central CATB. Yung Benpres, the total collection for Benpres was about 60% of the face value. And the total collections for Buy and Tell, which is the second largest exposure, was about 30% of face value.
So, yeah. Thank you, Mr. Manyala. If I may, Mr. Manyala, di naman po, you don't have to answer, but the narrative of what happened was, so maganda, 64% itong accounts na to, the 4 Lopez accounts. And in fact, DBP, yung pong ginawa nila, made a separate board discussion to put together the Lopez accounts. Again, it was also to package the entire thing. Mr. Aguilar was there as part of Credit Committee Assistant Manager. They were discussing it, and then later on, they put it as part of the 9 billion. Nilagay na po dun sa 9 billion para mapaganda yung buong package. So instead of foreclosing, because of the 180 days, nilagay po sa SPAB ninyo, which wala naman po kayong kasalanan. It was a business deal. Due diligence was conducted by Ernst & Young. You made a bid. But by doing that, you extended the loan for 3 to 4 years. Sometime to 2007-2010, nabayaran po lahat yan. And technically, yung binili ninyong 1.069 billion, ay benta nyo ng 1.25 billion. So, si government lost about 600 billion pesos. But from what you're saying, if only government waited, Maynilad and Central CATB would have gotten 100% of what was loaned, of what was borrowed from them, and maybe more.